Efficiency and northern charm, they asked a fast-talking redneck from the South to be your MC. I thought I was going to spin records, but that's apparently the DJ, not the MC. The reason they wanted a southerner here is because I can say it politely and with a smile, and y'all not be mad at me. Turn off your damn cell phones. Don't let them ring. It is my pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the American Principles Project for having me. It is a great organization. I've gotten to know over the last year. Frank Cannon's work, it's just been phenomenal helping set the agenda. I'm pleased to be here, pleased to start us off this evening, and pleased to keep the trains running on time. Because we have unceremoniously moved into the 21st century, that time period immediately before the Second Coming, where we all live tweet and blog events because we can't just live them, we do have a hashtag, APP Gala 2014. If you're on Twitter, and you know you are, or if you're on Facebook, you can use that hashtag. Now, it is my honor to introduce the Eastern Senior High School JROTC and the presentation of the colors, as well as Kristen Donovan, who's going to lead us in the national anthem this evening.
Mark time, march. Color guard, hold. Left, face. Present, arms.
Oh, say, can you see the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Order, arms. Right, face. Forward, march.
Thank you very much. We'd like to now invite Monsignor Stuart Swetland from Mount St. Mary's University to lead us in tonight's invocation.
Let us pray. Father, we do well to join all creation in heaven and on earth in praising you, our mighty God, creator of all. You made us to your own image and likeness and set us over all creation. Once you chose a people and gave them a destiny And when you brought them out of bondage to freedom, they carried with them the promise that all would be blessed and all could be free. It happened to our fathers who came to this land as if out of the desert into a place of promise and hope. It happens to us still in our time as you lead all towards a blessed vision of peace and justice. And so with hearts full of love, we join the angels and saints today and every day of our lives to sing your glory in hymns of endless praise, to pray for our nation and her leaders, and to recommit to seeking justice and peace for all. Heavenly Father, we bless you for all your kindnesses to us. We particularly thank you today that we live in a land where we are free to worship you in the way that each of us have come to know and understand you to be. Bless our nation. Bless those entrusted with the care and protection of the common good. Bless the work of the American Principles Project. Help us to be mindful of those less fortunate than ourselves, the poor, the homeless, the unemployed, those yearning to be free. Bless the food that we are about to receive to our use and us to thy holy name. Amen.
I have a several-hour-a-night radio show down in Atlanta, Georgia, on the nation's most listened to talk station, WSB, and I'm used to talking for several hours off the top of my head, no script involved. And so I'm supposed to introduce Sean Fieler, the chairman of the board of the American Principles Project, and I was just going to talk off the top of my head, but he sits on more boards than Robbie George, so I figured I better actually read them. Sean Fieler is the chairman of the board of the American Principles Project, and he's helped guide the organization's thinking on how to unite social and economic principles in this country at this time when it seems like we can be so divided amongst ourselves on that front. He's the president of Equinox Partners and the Coroto Fund. Sean also serves as the chairman of the Chiaroscuro Foundation and serves as a board member of the Witherspoon Institute, the Manhattan Institute, the Dominican Foundation, the Committee for Monetary and Research and Education, the Acton Institute, and one very near and dear to me, the Susan B. Anthony List. He's appeared on numerous news programs speaking about monetary policy: Bloomberg, CNN, Fox News, NPR, the BBC. Well, if we were asking for a CV, maybe we found someone more qualified to be president of the United States than the amateur we've got there. But on the other hand, he's probably right where he needs to be, helping advance freedom and liberty in the country. It really is my pleasure to introduce Sean Fieler to you.
And it is it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Paul. We all know Senator Paul, who, along with Jay-Z, Pope Francis, was named one of 2013's most influential people in the world by Time magazine. But despite the acclaim, he's still a pretty regular guy, as best as I can tell. I had a chance to meet him on a few occasions, and I was as impressed with what he said as I was with his ability to listen. Senator Paul can remain interested in a conversation that he's not monopolizing, a rare skill for an important person. The humility of Senator Paul's approach kind of reminded me of his dad, who I found to be equally generous with his time and his observations. I guess the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. The similarities between the two men are, after all, remarkable. Their sincerity, their fidelity to principle, their careers in medicine, and most notably, they both have an instinctive commitment to freedom and awareness of tyranny that mirrors the sentiments of our founding fathers. But while Senator Paul can champion freedom for freedom's sake with the best of them, he is equally able to make the case to the more practically minded, and even to those who seemingly have lost their taste for freedom, reaching out to those in the middle reaching out to the skeptics, to the young, to the minorities, to the immigrants. For Senator Paul clearly understands that we are in the business of winning hearts and minds, not of winnowing down the Republican Party to a core of true believers. To do this outreach, Senator Paul is putting a human face on freedom, talking about people, their dignity, their aspirations, and calling us all to a higher purpose for which our freedom was intended. Senator Paul has been so effective in this effort that the New York Times has begun to take front page above the fold shots at him. This is, to my mind, no greater compliment can be had than this. Having worked in New York for the past 19 years, I can tell you, you're probably not doing anything worthwhile until the New York Times is taking you on. Of course, Senator Paul's critics are not solely confined to the left. There are those on the right who say that Senator Paul is so concerned with the threat of tyranny here at home that as president he would not place a great enough emphasis on protecting us from foreign threats. On this point, we need look no further than Senator Paul's repeated embrace of Reagan's doctrine of peace through strength. Strength that, as Reagan clearly understood, must be rooted in a free and prosperous society and a principled foreign policy. So for my part, I would be very pleased if Senator Paul were elected the next president of the United States. Senator?
Thank you. You know, I thought the New York Times was going to be fair to me. But I got an inkling that maybe they weren't going to be fair when they took a hero of mine, an abolitionist, a famous abolitionist from before the war, for 30 years who wrote about abolition and the equality of man, Lysander Spooner, and they called him a Confederate sympathizer. So, you know, I'm quoting him because he's an abolitionist, and the New York Times describes him as Confederate sympathizer. So there's a little bit of lack of objectivity on the New York Times part. When I first moved up here, I lived with my dad for a few months. It didn't work out, and we had to part ways, but one of the funniest things that came from our living together was that somebody did some cartoons, and the cartoons were he and I standing in the kitchen. And it's me saying, "Dad, now I'm going to pay you for, I have a check here, I'm going to pay you for this month's rent." And his response, "Son, we only take gold and silver in this household." And then the next cartoon was me holding a list and saying, "Dad, I'm going to the grocery store, making a list. Is there anything you'd like?" And his response was, "Son, we don't do central planning in this household." But the main reason we parted ways is because I hated the traffic, and so I moved into the city. But it's been an interesting experience here. When I first was elected, one of the senators called me on the phone, and he said, "Yeah, the first 6 months you're there, you'll pinch yourself, and you'll say, 'How did I get here amongst these really important people?' And he said, then the next 6 months you'll pinch yourself and say, 'How the heck did the rest of these guys get here?'" I was in New York the other day, and we came upon the Federal Reserve, and there were police everywhere. The road was jammed, and we said, "What happened?" And they said, "Well, the Federal Reserve has been robbed." And we said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, but they caught the thieves. They were in there, but they got the big safe open, but they were perplexed. They were flummoxed. They didn't know what to do with minus $17 trillion. So I've got good news and bad news for you. The good news is your government's open. The bad news is your government's open and borrowing about $1.4 million every minute. So just think about it. In the next 90 minutes of this speech, we're going to borrow over $100 million. Now, I'll try to spare you that. They told me I could speak early, and if I did a good job, I could get an entree. So I'm going to work on that. But you think about it. Good news, it's open. Bad news, we're not doing anything about it. And so many people chastise. I know Erick's never been chastised. Has anybody from the establishment ever chastised you, Erick? But the thing is that sometimes they say to us, "Why are you fighting? If you could just all get along, if we just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, everything would be fine." But here's the conundrum. While it may not be a good idea to shut government down, it's also not a good idea just to give your government a blank check. I mean, we can't just keep voting for the spending bills. We can't just keep voting to raise the debt ceiling without any kind of restraint. So we had this shutdown. And so they asked us during the shutdown, they came to us. I see Kerry, Congressman Kerry Bentivolio from Michigan. Did we get something? They told us, say, essential employees and unessential employees. We got to list who was essential. The EPA turned their list in, 95% unessential. Now, you'd think there'd be a lesson we learned from that, but we didn't seem to. But they did learn one thing. They were going down the rolls, determining that 95% of the employees were unessential, and they found this guy, Jonathan Beale. And his record looked great. He'd been getting performance reviews and bonuses, one after another. But it turns out he'd been missing. No one had seen him in 6 months. He'd worked there for 11 years. In fact, he was the right-hand man to Gina McCarthy. You know what his specialty was? Global warming. But his other passion was that he was a fake agent for the CIA, and he told his employers that he was working for the CIA, and that's why he had to miss so much work. So here you can imagine Jonathan Beale laying by the pool with a beer in his hand saying, "Can't talk now, I'm in Istanbul." Got a real secret agent thing going on here. Did this for 11 years. They finally found him during the shutdown. So maybe one good thing came from the shutdown. They looked who was actually showing up for work and who wasn't showing up for work. But we got into all of this because the other side says there is no room to cut. The president says and pulls his hair out and says, "Woe is me, there is no room to cut. What could we possibly cut?" So I sent him a letter. He said they couldn't survive the sequester. He said, "We'll have to fire the air traffic controllers. The planes will crash." And I was like, really? The first people you're going to fire are the air traffic controllers? So we disabused him of that, and then he said, "Oh, but your meat will be rancid. We'll have to fire the meat inspectors." Like, really? Those are the first people you can come up with in all of government? So I wrote him a letter and said, look, if you just don't rehire the people who retire, that's $6 billion a year. We went a year and a half after passing the sequester without doing anything, with the president adamantly saying in the debates that there would be no sequester. And then the sequester came, and he had done nothing. That had been $9 billion could have been saved just through attrition. I also gave him another suggestion. Why don't we look for the $100 billion that is missing? We don't know where $100 billion is. It was spent, but every year within a $3.8 trillion budget, there's $100 billion unaccounted for, a little more than $100 billion. Why don't we look for it? I also suggested, why don't we have competitive contracts? That's a novel idea. You're scratching your head and saying, surely we go with the lowest bid. Well, we kind of do and we kind of don't. You get the lowest bid for government work, but only if it involves a prevailing wage that might be 2 and 3 times what the average wage is in that area. So if we build a school in Bowling Green, Kentucky, it often costs 20 and 30% more if we're using federal money because we have to use a labor wage or a union wage out of Chicago. All of these things, that would save $10 billion. You know, there's all kinds of savings to be had. And I wrote him a letter, and if anybody has any communication, you can tell the president, I haven't gotten my response yet. I'm still waiting. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe if we embarrass him, you know, his great idea was he cut the White House tours. 5 different agencies said they would have to furlough people, but after about 6 months of the sequester, nobody was furloughed. They all found some other savings. And what was the sequester? What was this we're bickering about? What was it that was so impossible to adhere to? If you've seen it on television, this is the baseline. There is no flat baseline. This is the baseline of spending over 10 years. This is the baseline after the sequester. You almost can't see the white between the lines, but we were actually slowing down the rate of growth of government. So the president says, oh, where can we find the savings? So I said, well, you know, if you're not going to listen to the big items, why don't I shame you with some of the smaller items? We spent $500,000 last year developing a menu for Mars. If you've got a 26-year-old kid living in your basement, you want to get him a job, this is a great job. Pays $5,000 stipend, 2 weeks in Hawaii, all expenses paid, the prerequisites for getting the job, you want to go too. I do too. I'm happy to go on this. But the prerequisite, it's difficult to get this job. One of the things you have to do is you have to like food. So they sent a bunch of college kids to Hawaii for 2 weeks to develop a menu for Mars, and you know what they came up with? Pizza. So the other day I'm looking for other wasteful things. I think this was in Tom Coburn's waste book, and I said, well, we've discovered that we want pizza when we get to Mars. How are we going to make it? Well, NASA spent $125,000 developing a 3D printer to make pizza. That was in between spending $20,000 per person to have people lie on their side for 70 days at a time. It goes on and on. We spent $5 million studying the collective action of fish, trying to learn about democracy from fish. We spent $1.8 million on roll-up beef jerky. So just the government from top to bottom has waste. And just cutting the waste would be an enormous step in the right direction. But you know what we did discover? Is that even though the sequester made us do some things, and some of it even for things we believe in, like national defense, it was actually slowing down the rate of growth of government. So what happened? About a month ago, the Kumbaya crowd said, we've got to get together and we've got to just have a deal with the Democrats. So we got the Ryan Murray plan. What did it do? Abandons the sequester. So we've given up on the sequester. And think back to how we got the sequester. In 2011, there was a big fight over raising the budget ceiling, or raising the debt ceiling. We got it by attaching to it the sequester. What did S&P say back then? S&P judged that the sequester was inadequate, and they downgraded our debt. They didn't downgrade our debt because we were debating and fighting over it. They downgraded our debt because they said it wasn't enough. Remember Bowles-Simpson? Bowles-Simpson said you had to cut $4 trillion. The sequester was $2 trillion. So what we had was judged by S&P to be inadequate. And so what did we do? We abandoned what was inadequate. So what does spending do over the next 2 years? Spending goes up $63 billion. And people say, oh, well, it balances out over 10 years. There has never been a 10-year plan ever adhered to, okay? They are not to be trusted. The sequester lasted 2 years, okay? Budget plans in the United States are about the equivalent of an agricultural plan in the Soviet Union, all right? Remember the 5-year plans they would have in the Soviet Union? They would say, well, production is so great, and we met all of our production goals, and there'd be no bread, there'd be no food, there'd be starvation, but they met their goals. That's about what a budget plan is like in the United States. It's not believable. So the 2 years that we're going to increase spending are really all that counts. We've abandoned restraint, and it's disappointing to me. But this is when I get really disappointed, and Carrie probably remembers this vote. There was a vote over Twiggy the squirrel. Twiggy the squirrel is a water skiing squirrel. And I'm like a lot of people. I like to look at cool stuff on the internet like a water skiing squirrel. That is fun to look at. But I get mad when I think that I've got to pay for it, okay? The U.S. taxpayer is paying $3 million a year to advertise American walnuts in India with Twiggy the squirrel being the spokesman. So it's $3 million. And everybody, the people who like this kind of stuff say, well, you'd never balance the budget getting rid of $3 million. Well, I'm just getting started, all right? So we go on and on. But the thing is that's not an excuse for doing stuff that we don't have the money to do. So they had a vote in the House of Representatives to get rid of Twiggy the squirrel, cut $3 million for this program advertising walnuts in India. We lost 320 to 98. We lost the majority of the Republicans. Over half of the Republicans voted to keep Twiggy the squirrel. So you ask yourself, how are we ever going to talk about Social Security or Medicare? That's 2/3 of the budget. 2/3 of the budget is entitlements. These are emotional things that are difficult to talk about that have to be reformed or we're going to bankrupt our country, but we can't cut Twiggy the squirrel. So where are we? I mean, they're really, people say don't fight, you just go along to get along with people. Here's the thing. I've been involved since I was a kid. I was at the 1976 convention when it was Reagan versus Ford. Everybody else told Reagan to shut up too. They said, shut up and wait your turn. And he didn't. There was a big fight over what was the direction of the Republican Party. So fighting is not, it doesn't have to be impolite, it doesn't have to be rude, but there needs to be a struggle over the direction of the party. We have to decide, are we going to go bold, are we going to go big, or are we going to go and become Democrat light. That debate always occurs in a party. And so we should fight. We should struggle for what we believe in and try to move the party forward. Now, I think there are some other issues that can move the party forward also. And some of these, I would say, are more libertarian issues. And to some, that's sort of still a bad word. To others, I think it's a word that may expand the party. But what I would say is liberty doesn't mean libertine. To many of us, libertarian means freedom and liberty, but we also see that freedom needs tradition. Don Devine's a friend of mine, and some of you may know him. He wrote a book called America's Way Back. Some of it takes upon and expands upon some of the ideas of Frank Meyer, who wrote with National Review once upon a time. But freedom needs tradition, and he talks about how these are the two harmonizing ideals that we need, freedom and tradition. Freedom needs tradition to give it its balance and its stability and its sense of family and all of community and those kind of things. But tradition needs freedom to invigorate it and to give it spirit and to give it excitement. So I don't see libertarianism as sort of you can do whatever you want. There is a role for government. There's a role for family. There's a role for marriage. There's a role for the protection of life. In fact, I said last year at the march, I said, or asked the question, can a nation or can a civilization long endure that doesn't respect life? I don't think they can. But while there is a role for government, there's also a role for those of you who are not in government. In fact, as big or bigger. You want to promote family, you need to talk about it in your communities, with your kids. You want to promote marriage, you need to talk about it with your kids and in your community. I can't make kids get married. But the thing is, I think marriage is important, not only for social and religious and moral reasons, but it's incredibly important just plain for economic reasons. Charles Murray wrote a book, Coming Apart at the Seams, and in it, it's two worlds. There's the world that goes to college and is married, and there's the world that doesn't go to college and isn't married, and there's enormous amounts of poverty in the world that doesn't make it to college and doesn't get married and has children. This isn't something the government can always fix, but we all need to be part of trying to fix it. But as far as liberty issues that could broaden our appeal, I think there are things that we can and should talk about as Christians. We believe in forgiveness. I think the criminal justice system should have some element of forgiveness. There are people that should be separated and that we don't want anything to do with, and we have to incarcerate them to keep them away from us and to keep us safe. I'm all for that. But there are also people who make youthful mistakes who I think deserve a second chance. In my state, you never vote again if you're convicted of a felony. But a felony could be growing marijuana plants in college. A friend of mine's brother did 30 years ago. He has an MBA, but he can't vote, can't own a gun, and he's a house painter with an MBA because he has to check a box saying he was a convicted felon. These are ideas not many Republicans have talked about before, but I think if we talk about these issues, we take them to the minority community, often the African American, sometimes the Hispanic community. 3 out of 4 people in prison are black or brown. But if you look at surveys on who uses drugs, whites and blacks and Hispanics use it about the same rates. You don't have as good an attorney if you don't have money, and some of the prosecution has tended to go where it's easier to prosecute people. I think these are things we can look at. And I'm not talking about legalization. What I'm talking about is making the criminal justice system fair and giving people a second chance when they've served their time. I think we need not to give the other side the high moral ground. Arthur Brooks came and talked to us at lunch today, and I liked what he had to say. He said, Democrats, they have sort of materialism wrapped in a cloak of morality. He says, we are the moral party, but we wrap our morality and all the good that we believe in all this materialism and numbers and statistics, and we lose what we really are for. We are the party that really does want to help the long-term unemployed. We are the party that wants to help those who live in poverty. It needs to be a debate not about which party cares or which party wants to help people, but about which policies work. There's 20 million people that are either underemployed or out of work right now. talk about the inequality of income. It's worse under this president and 5 years of this president than it has ever been. The poor are getting poorer. You look at the recovery, most of the recovery has been with the wealthy. The poor are stagnant, and their incomes are being stolen from them through inflation. We need to talk about how when you borrow and spend money, you steal the value of the dollar. And who does it hurt? Not the wealthy. It hurts the working class. It hurts those citizens on fixed income, the elderly. These are issues that we shouldn't give up and say, oh, issues of poverty, the Democrats care more. Not only do they not care more, their policies don't work and aren't working. So we shouldn't give them the high moral ground. I recently introduced something called economic freedom zones. Economic freedom zones dramatically lowers taxes in areas where there's 1.5 times the national average of unemployment. For Detroit, it would leave $1.3 billion in Detroit. Not that we would take it from Houston and send it to Detroit. Not that we take it from Kentucky and send it to Detroit. We just leave it there. We never send it here. And the real beauty of a tax cut, and why we need to make this argument, and this isn't going on, by the way. In Washington, what passes for bold is, hey, we're for revenue-neutral tax reform. It's like, I don't care. I would just soon be at home or practicing medicine. I didn't come up here to be for just taxing you more and you a little bit less. Why don't we be what we used to be for, dramatically lowering taxes because it will stimulate the economy and create millions of jobs. When Reagan lowered taxes, 20 million jobs were created. Let's be for that again. No one's ever going to knock on a door for a politician who says, hey, I'm for revenue-neutral tax reform. Nobody cares. But the other thing about reducing taxes is let's compare it, a tax reduction as a stimulus, to a government stimulus. The problem with a government stimulus is 9 out of 10 businesses fail. You've seen restaurants, they come and go. So if you give the money to Washington, they pass it out and say, hey, you create jobs, 9 out of 10 times the government's going to give it to the wrong people. Think Solyndra. Think $535 million given to the wrong person to sell the wrong products. We shouldn't be in the business of giving money to anyone to say, hey, you create jobs. But if we lower taxes on businesses that the consumers have already voted for, then it's money that will work. It's money that will stimulate the economy. And why don't we direct it to areas of impoverishment? We have a lot of poor counties in my state. Been poor, some because of the president's war on coal, but some because we've been that way for generations. We could change some of this and be the party that is for helping those who live in bad circumstances. But we got to do it through giving back their own money, not trying to find money from somewhere else. And finally, I would say that if we want to win again, if we want to be a bigger party, not only do we have to be a party that looks like the rest of America, black, white, brown, with tattoos, without tattoos, earrings, without earrings, we have to look more like the rest of America. But we also have to have a party that has a message of optimism. There's a painter by the name of Robert Henry, and he told young painters, he said, paint like a man coming over the hill singing. And I love the image of that. I think when we become the party that is the party of the Bill of Rights, not just the Second Amendment, but the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, the whole Bill of Rights, when we become that party of liberty, that party of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, when we become that party and we proclaim that message, when we proclaim that message with passion, and when we proclaim that message like a man coming over the hill singing, then I think our ideas will win the day again. Thank you very much.
Senator, thanks very much for that. Because Obamacare is going to render us all voluntarily unemployed in the next year or so, we've decided to feed you. So please enjoy your dinner, and we'll continue with the program sometime around dessert.